Hello and thanks for joining us. In this talk, we'll be addressing the issue of contact between sociolectal varieties, and more specifically, how different patterns of exposure to the same two varieties can lead to different patterns of response to social cues during perception. Our starting point is the now well-documented finding that contextual cues to social indices can influence the perceptual behavior of listeners. Differences in cues related to gender, socioeconomic status, or age, for example, have been shown to induce a shift in the identification boundary between two neighboring phonemes. Studies have also shown that cues to regional social indices associated with vowel differences can influence the subjective perception of vowel quality for a given vowel category. In a study on New Zealand listeners, for example, Hay and Draeger showed that implicitly presented cues to either Australia or New Zealand resulted in a subjective characterization of certain vowels as either more Australian-like or more New Zealand-like, respectively. More recent studies have shown that social cues can influence the perception and interpretation of intonation as well. Warren, for example, explored how final rising contours in New Zealand English are interpreted as either yes-no questions or as uptalk statements. Since younger speakers are more likely to use uptalk rises, the study manipulated the formant characteristics of a vowel token occurring earlier in the sentence as a cue to the age of the speaker, and explored how this interacted with the specific type of final rise. While neither manipulation directly influenced listeners' interpretation patterns, the specific combination of vowel age type, rise onset timing, and interpretation was found to influence listeners' processing of the final rises in terms of both response times and in terms of mouse movements. Our own previous study explored how regional cues influence the interpretation of a particular intonation contour by Corsican French listeners. The intonational contour in question involves a final rise fall whose peak is aligned to the penultimate syllable of the utterance. Both Corsican French and Continental French include such a contour in their inventory. However, in Corsican French, the contour is used primarily to mark yes-no questions, while in Continental French, it is generally used to mark statements. In a between subjects manipulation, listeners were exposed to an implicit cue to either Corsica or Paris. The results, which we'll describe in more detail shortly, showed that listeners in the Corsican condition were significantly more likely to interpret the contour as a question than listeners in the Continental condition. A few studies have called into question the extent to which the effects of social cues on perception generalize to all contexts involving contact between varieties. Lawrence, for example, applied the vowel quality paradigm used by Niedzielski to an analogous context involving Northern English listeners, but was unable to replicate the pattern of results. The author interprets this failure to replicate as counter-evidence for the claims of earlier related studies. Walker, Sake, and Cox tested whether the effects found by Hay and Draeger for New Zealand listeners would extend to Australian listeners, who presumably also have contact with both varieties. The effect was not replicated, and the authors interpret this lack of reciprocity as a theoretically surprising finding. It's important to note that most of these studies are situated with respect to the predictions of exemplar theoretic models. According to those models, social cues influence perception through the differential activation of stored experiences with different varieties. In the absence of specific cues, the perceptual boundary between two categories would be determined more or less directly by their phonetic distribution. However, when a specific social index is activated, the perceptual system behaves slightly more as though it were composed only of exemplars associated to that index, resulting in, for example, the shift of a categorization boundary. These predictions, however, are contingent on a number of assumptions regarding an individual's language experience. Not only is it necessary to have contact with a second variety, but the quantity of exposure to that variety also matters. If the proportion of stored exemplars associated with a second variety is large relative to the total number of stored exemplars, then the effect is predicted to be robust. Conversely, if the proportion is small relative to all other exemplars, then the size of the effect is predicted to be smaller. In these two examples, we would expect the categorization boundary to undergo a comparatively smaller shift for the situation on the right as compared to that on the left. For our previous study, the predictions were grounded in the observation that Corsican individuals have a high degree of contact with Continental French, particularly through media and tourism. In other words, their experience with Continental French makes up a substantial proportion of their total lifetime input. At the same time, we recognize the importance of inter-individual variation in this regard. We therefore modeled, in exemplar theoretic terms, the specific case of the interpretation of the penultimate rise-fall as a function of an individual's proportional exposure to each variety. Our model predicts that the effect size of the regional cue manipulation should be correlated with how balanced an individual's exposure is with the two varieties. In other words, individuals who have similar amounts of input from the two varieties are predicted to respond more robustly to the social prime manipulation as compared to those whose experience is strongly dominated by only one of the two varieties. In the present study, we explore this issue by replicating our previous experiment with a population that has a less balanced exposure to the two varieties, namely Continental French listeners. Our general prediction is that this population should show a lower degree of sensitivity to the social cue manipulation.
Corsica is a Mediterranean island which used to be under the political influence of Italian cities during centuries. Its vernacular language, Corsican, is therefore a Romance language belonging to the Italo-Roman group. It is nowadays considered an endangered language. Corsica is part of France since the mid-18th century, and French is now the native language of most Corsican people. However, the variety of French spoken in Corsica is influenced by Corsican, especially its intonation. For instance, in Corsican and Corsican French, polar questions are realized with a final rising-falling contour, with the F0 peak aligned to the penultimate syllable.
Jacques a taillé les amandiers.
As for Continental French, polar questions are realized with a final rising contour.
Il va reneiger?
The pattern for Corsican and Corsican French is also associated with an additional rise-fall on the first accentual phrase, which surfaces only when the syntactic subject is a full-noun phrase. For Continental French people, this tune is very typical of Corsican French. The literature on Continental French intonation describes a similar penultimate rise-fall conveying statements. Different authors propose different tonal codings, as well as different variants of statement meanings for this contour. We assume that these authors all describe the same penultimate rise-fall conveying a statement, which we will consider as the continental version of the penultimate rise-fall, and that we will phonologically code as L, H plus downstate H star, L%. We conducted a perception experiment of utterances bearing a penultimate rise-fall intonation. The crucial between subject condition involved a prime that was only in the background of the experiment and not suggestive of the identity of the speaker. The prime evoked the regional contrast between Corsica and continental France. The task consisted of a forced choice continuation of a dialogue that was either consistent with a question interpretation as preferred in Corsican French or a statement interpretation as preferred in Continental French. The experimental targets consisted of 32 short utterances involving declarative syntax, with a clitic subject to avoid the replication of the penultimate rise-fall on the subject, and a penultimate rise-fall contour. All were produced by a male native speaker of Continental French and auditorily presented to the participants.
Il faut mélanger.
Each target sentence was paired with two generic short responses of a virtual addressee that participants had to identify with in order to choose the most relevant reaction to the target sentence. One with a question-consistent response, more appropriate in the Corsican French variety, and the other, a statement-consistent response, more appropriate in the continental variety. Both responses were simultaneously provided visually on the screen. 60 filler items bearing different intonation patterns were included as distractors. Each target was paired with two types of preceding contexts. These contexts involved short descriptions of situations involving a recurrent character named Antoine, who is understood to be the speaker of the target utterances. 1/4 of the context was designed to set up an expectation that the target utterance is a question, while the other 3/4 were intended to be neutral in this regard. This step was taken in order to establish that participants' response choices indeed reflect their illocutionary interpretation of the target sentences. It was accomplished by varying the verb of reported speech in the final sentence of the context. Il lui demande, he asks her, for question bias in context, versus il s'adresse à elle, he speaks to her, for neutral contexts. Two regional daily newspapers were used as visual social primes, the Parisien for the continental condition and Corse Matin for the Corsican condition. They were similar to each other in size and layout and were selected to include as much region-specific information as possible. During the experiment, one of the two newspapers was placed next to the laptop, and the experimenter drew attention to it by asking if it belonged to the participant. Participants were then asked to read the instructions, and the experimenter stepped out of the room for several minutes in order to give ample time to the participants to observe the newspaper before the experiment and to do the task. The experimental procedure was as follows. For each item, the textual context first appeared on the screen. After reading the context, participants pressed the spacebar to hear the audio of the target.
Il est éliminé.
And then again to hear it a second time.
Il est éliminé.
After the second playback, the response options appeared on the screen, and participants were asked to choose the option that was the most appropriate reaction to the target by Antoine's interlocutor. One keyboard key identified by a green versus a pink square had to be pressed to give the chosen response. No limit on responses was enforced. Here are our hypotheses for the new experiment. Like for Corsican French listeners, we expect Continental French listeners to be sensitive to the question context elicited by the verb and to choose more question-consistent responses when the verb is demande, ask, than when the verb is s'adresse à, speak to. In neutral context, we expect Continental French listeners to choose less question-consistent responses than Corsican French listeners did, since the penultimate rise fall conveys a statement in their variety rather than a question. Finally, and more importantly, we expect Continental French listeners to be less sensitive to implicit regional prime than Corsican French listeners were, since they are less exposed to Corsican French than Corsican French listeners were to Continental French.
Before reporting the results of the present study, we'll briefly review those of our previous study. This bar plot shows the proportion of question-consistent responses by context type and by regional prime. First, and consistent with our expectations, there were more question-consistent responses in the question-biased context than in the neutral context. Second, there were more question-consistent responses in the Corsican prime condition than in the continental prime condition. In a mixed effects GLM analysis using model comparisons, both of these effects were found to be significant, but with no significant interaction. Descriptively, the pattern was very similar for the Continental French listeners in the present study. There were more question responses in the question-biased context, as well as more question responses in the Corsican prime condition. Contrary to the previous study, however, only the effect of context was found to be significant. In other words, there's no evidence that continental listeners' interpretation of the penultimate rise-fall is influenced by implicit regional primes. Observationally, the continental listeners responded overall less often with a question-consistent response as compared to the Corsican listeners. While the two studies are technically separate experiments, we nevertheless wanted to explore our hypothesis that the two populations interpret the contour differently, as well as whether the two populations differ in their sensitivity to the regional prime manipulation, which would be supported by the finding of a significant interaction between participant group and regional prime. We therefore carried out a post hoc statistical analysis of the combined results with participant group as an additional fixed factor. This test indeed revealed a significant effect of participant group, though the interaction between participant group and regional prime was not significant.
As expected, Continental French listeners chose less question-consistent responses than Corsican French listeners did in our previous study, since the penultimate rise-fall conveys a statement in their variety rather than a question. More importantly, the social prime manipulation did not significantly influence the interpretation of the penultimate rise-fall by Continental French listeners, while our previous experiments showed that Corsican French listeners were sensitive to it. However, we interpret this lack of an effect of social prime neither as surprising nor as in contradiction with Ian Drager's findings. Instead, we expected such an effect because of a less balanced exposure of Continental French listeners than Corsican French listeners to the two competing varieties of French.
Returning to the model presented in our previous study, it's interesting to note that for both populations that were tested, the difference in the mean proportion of question responses across regional prime conditions was squarely within the specific range predicted by that model. While the statistical results make it difficult to conclude that there's a specific relationship between the behavior patterns of the two populations, the consistency of the qualitative pattern of responses is highly suggestive. In other words, it's quite plausible that the lack of a significant effect for the continental listeners can be explained by a reduced but still present sensitivity to the regional prime manipulation, a difference which is straightforwardly predicted by our model. Future studies could address this issue more directly by, for example, testing two populations within the context of the same experiment, or alternatively, it would be highly useful to employ more precise measures of inter-individual differences in experience within a population. This latter approach would be analogous to what has previously been used in studies exploring the role of age, gender, and socioeconomic status. Thanks again for visiting our talk, and please don't hesitate to email us if you have comments or questions.